I was just adjusting my camera lens when I heard the heavy crunch of footsteps behind me. I turned, already irritated, expecting to see a curious passerby. Instead, it was an old man, his eyes narrowed and disapproving as they flicked over my outfit and then back to my camera. He stopped just short of the path and squinted at me. "Shouldn't be here, miss," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Especially not this time of day." I let out a sigh, trying not to roll my eyes. "It's public property," I replied, dismissing him. This wasn't the first time some stranger had given me a hard time about my graveyard photography. They usually thought I was doing something sacrilegious or disrespectful. "You don't understand," he said, his tone firmer. "You think you're alone, but you're not. This place isn't safe after dark. The shade doesn't like to be watched." "The shade?" I echoed, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Right. A shadowy ghost just waiting to scare off goth girls with cameras?" His expression hardened, and for a moment, I almost felt a twinge of discomfort. There was something unyielding in his gaze, like he genuinely believed what he was saying. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "People have gone missing here, young lady. They've been warned, just like you, and they didn't listen. Whatever it is that lurks here, it watches you, and when you look back, it gets closer." I wanted to laugh, to tell him his ghost story wasn't going to scare me off. But a chill crept up my spine, and for some reason, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the headstones. The sun was sinking fast, casting the whole cemetery in a dim gray light. The tall shadows made the place feel lonelier than usual, and I hated to admit that maybe he had rattled me a little. "I've been here plenty of times," I replied, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Nothing's ever happened. I just want to get some shots and leave." The man sighed, his expression softening just slightly, almost as if he pitied me. "Suit yourself, then," he muttered, turning to leave. "But don't say I didn't warn you." I watched him disappear down the path, feeling an odd pang of relief mixed with lingering discomfort. As soon as he was gone, I shook off the tension in my shoulders and turned back to my camera. Just a ghost story, I told myself, probably one he spins to keep kids from hanging out in the cemetery at night. I wasn't here to cause trouble. I just wanted to capture the beauty of it, the contrast between life and death, light and shadow. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and got back to work. I framed a shot of an ancient tombstone half covered in ivy, the kind of moody, atmospheric shot I loved. But as I looked through the viewfinder, I felt it again, that prickling sense that someone was watching me. I lowered the camera and scanned the area. The cemetery was empty, but the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if they were shifting toward me. I brushed off the feeling and took another photo, then another. As I adjusted the angle, I caught sight of a dark shape at the edge of my frame. It looked like a person, a tall figure standing still among the graves. I froze, lowering the camera, but the figure was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after the old man's story. But when I lifted the camera again, the figure was back, closer this time, barely more than a smudge of darkness in the distance. A shiver ran down my spine, and I almost laughed at myself, at the way my hands were shaking. Just shadows, I told myself. Just shadows and stories. But as I turned to leave, I took one last photo, almost on impulse. When I glanced at the screen, my heart skipped a beat. The figure was there, standing in the background, its dark, featureless shape watching me from among the graves. And this time, I didn't need the old man's warning to feel the sudden urge to get out of there as fast as I could. I sat cross-legged on my bed, my laptop balanced on my knees as I flipped through the photos from the graveyard chute. The first few shots were typical, graves blanketed in shadows, the soft wash of twilight over weathered stone. But as I clicked forward, my heart stuttered. There, standing in the far corner of one frame, was that same dark shape I'd seen earlier in the cemetery. I leaned in, squinting at the screen. The figure was hazy, almost like a smudge of darkness that shouldn't have been there. But as I zoomed in, my stomach tightened. It was no trick of the light. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, its form distorted as if it were half hidden in shadow. I told myself it was just my imagination. I clicked to the next photo, hoping it had vanished, but it hadn't. In this one, it was closer, as if it had shifted position while I was adjusting my shot. The figure still had no face, no features, just a smear of black that seemed to absorb the dim light around it. I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was almost like this shadow was aware of me, aware of the camera's lens, and somehow, through it, aware of me here, staring back at it. I shivered, shutting the laptop for a moment, trying to laugh it off, but the laugh died in my throat. There was nothing funny about it. My room felt suddenly oppressive, the silence thickening. Even the light from my bedside lamp seemed weaker, as if it were struggling against a weight pressing down. I opened my laptop again, feeling a ridiculous urge to confront the thing in the photos, to prove to myself that I wasn't just scaring myself over nothing. One by one, I scrolled through the images. In each shot, the shade was there, closer every time, as though it were following me from grave to grave. I tried to convince myself that maybe I'd accidentally caught a shadow cast by something nearby, maybe a trick of light bending through the trees. But my own reflection in the laptop screen betrayed me. I looked pale, wide-eyed, like I was seeing something I couldn't explain. Then, just when I thought I couldn't bear to look any longer, a soft sound broke the silence. A whisper, barely a murmur, brushing the edges of hearing. I froze, holding my breath, straining to listen. It was faint, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. But then it came again, a sibilant hiss, almost like my name. My pulse hammered in my throat as I snapped the laptop shut, my hands shaking. This was ridiculous. I'd been alone in my room for hours. No one else was here. But the whisper had felt real, felt close. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to shake the feeling that the shade was somehow seeping into my space, inching closer through the shadows, even from the distance of that cemetery. A nervous laugh slipped out, sharp and forced. Just a story, I muttered to myself, but the words fell flat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see the shape of that figure in the corners, just beyond the reach of the light. Unable to stand the silence, I opened the laptop again. The screen flickered to life, and I stared at the final photo I'd taken in the cemetery. There it was, the same shape, looming in the background, except this time it was no longer just a distant shadow. It was almost right behind me, too close, as if it had reached for me in the moment I'd pressed the shutter. The whispering started again, louder now, more insistent, echoing through my mind in fragmented words I couldn't quite understand. My heart pounded as I slammed the laptop shut again, my breaths coming short and fast. It was just a photo. Just shadows, pixels, nothing more. But as I sat there in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shade wasn't trapped in those photos. It was here with me, somewhere in the room, lurking just out of sight. And the worst part was that a small, terrified part of me wanted to see it, to look directly into the darkness and find whatever had reached out from the graveyard to follow me home. The next afternoon, despite the gnawing fear still settled in my chest, I found myself back at the cemetery gates. I'd barely slept, haunted by the whispering that seemed to hang in the air of my room. Every corner had felt like it was hiding something. Every shadow stretched just a little too long. It was unbearable, and I hoped, that coming back here would ground me, maybe dispel the dread that had latched onto me. As I made my way through the twisting paths of gravestones, I told myself I'd figure out what I'd really seen in those photos. There had to be a logical explanation. Some strange lighting, or maybe a person just barely captured at the edge of the frame. Something that would stop this irrational feeling that I'd brought something back with me. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the man standing near one of the older graves until he spoke. "Back again, are you?" he said, his voice rough and dry like gravel scraping together. I turned and saw an older man, hunched slightly, dressed in worn work clothes, his hands caked with dirt. He must have been the cemetery's groundskeeper. "Yeah, I just wanted to take a few more photos," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual, as if I didn't feel every hair on my arms standing on end. The man's eyes narrowed, and a shadow of something darker passed over his face. "They always do," he muttered, almost to himself. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, my curiosity piqued despite my nerves. I wasn't sure if it was just my fear twisting his words, but he seemed genuinely troubled, as if he'd seen something himself. "People come here alone, taking photos, asking questions. They always come back, thinking they'll find answers. He glanced at the gravestones, his gaze lingering as though he could see something I couldn't. But answers aren't what they find. Not here. A shiver crawled down my spine. I forced myself to ask, "You mean the shade?" He nodded slowly, looking around us as if he expected something to be listening. "It's been here as long as I have. Longer, maybe. People think it's just an old ghost story, something to scare kids off. But the shade isn't a spirit. It's something else, something that thrives on the ones who stay too long, the ones who feel drawn to it." I swallowed hard, unable to shake the prickling fear rising inside me. "What is it? I mean, what does it want?" The man's gaze met mine, and for a moment I saw real fear in his eyes. "It doesn't want anything. It just is. A shadow of loneliness, anger, a darkness that waits. It takes whatever it finds." He glanced at me, his expression darkening. "And if it follows you all the way home." The words hit like a punch to the gut. All the memories from last night, the whispers, the shadow in my photos, flooded back with renewed terror. My voice trembled when I spoke. "But I didn't do anything. I was just taking pictures." He sighed, and his voice softened with something almost like pity. "That's the worst part. You don't have to do anything. It's the ones who notice it, the ones who feel that pull, who end up drawn in. And once you've seen it, well, it's already too late." I took a step back, my stomach twisting. My mind raced, replaying every flicker of shadow and every prickling sensation I'd felt since that first sighting. Maybe he was just an old man spinning stories, but somehow his words felt all too real. And in my gut, I knew he was right. The shade hadn't stayed behind in the cemetery. It had followed me, whispering, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. The man must have seen the fear on my face because he added, "You're young. Get away from here. Move on with your life and forget you ever came." But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the shadows between the graves, feeling the invisible tendrils of the shade curling around me. Forget? How could I forget something like that? I managed a nod, though I doubted I'd find it that easy to just walk away. I turned back toward the path, trying to keep my pace steady, trying not to look over my shoulder, as if even the act of looking back might somehow invite it closer. But as I passed through the gates, I could feel something pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating, the same chill I'd felt in my room last night. And I knew it wasn't over. Whatever the shade was, wherever it was, I felt its pull like a chain, dragging me back to the shadows it called home. I slammed my front door shut, locking it and leaning back against it, as if that thin barrier could hold off what I'd felt lurking back in the cemetery. I'd told myself that coming home would break the spell, that maybe the fear would dissipate once I left the graveyard behind. But even as I breathed in the familiar scent of my tiny apartment, I felt it, that same creeping sensation from last night, as if the shadows in every corner were just waiting for me to look away. I went straight to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, forcing myself to breathe. "It's just a story," I told myself. Just an old man with some spooky tales, and my mind running wild with it. But even as I closed my eyes, the whispers from the graveyard echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of the shade from my photos, the way it seemed to draw closer in each frame, as if it had been stalking me without my knowing. When I finally looked up, my reflection seemed wrong, off somehow, as if my own eyes didn't recognize me. My skin was pale, my face drawn, with dark circles etched under my eyes. I felt like I was staring at a stranger, someone who'd seen something they couldn't forget. A loud clink sounded from the living room. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I gripped the edge of the sink, willing myself to calm down, but every inch of me was tense, waiting. My mind raced with all the ways I could explain it. A neighbor, a draft, maybe even a cat outside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't any of those things. Slowly, I walked into the living room, my steps painfully quiet, afraid to make a sound. I scanned the room, trying to ignore the way my hands were trembling. The shadow in the far corner looked darker than usual, somehow deeper, as if it had a presence, a weight. I forced myself to look away, reassuring myself it was only my imagination. But then, in the silence, I heard it again, a faint whisper, slithering through the air, wrapping itself around my name like an invitation. Evie. The sound was barely audible, a ghost of a voice, yet it crawled under my skin. I backed up, stumbling over the coffee table, my mind screaming that I was alone, that it couldn't be real. But I couldn't ignore it. The voice, impossibly soft, coaxing me, calling me. "No," I whispered, clenching my fists, my voice trembling. "You're not real. You're just a story." I retreated to my bedroom, shutting the door and leaning against it, feeling my chest tighten with fear. I told myself not to listen, not to feed whatever dark corner of my mind had decided to make me a prisoner in my own home. I reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts, thinking of calling someone, anyone, but every option seemed useless. What could I even say? That shadows were whispering to me? I lay on my bed, curling under the covers, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. I tried to keep my eyes open, watching the room, but every shadow seemed to pulse, breathing, growing. My lids felt heavier, and eventually I sank into a restless sleep. Sometime in the night, I jolted awake, the darkness feeling impossibly thick around me. The room was silent, but the air was different, thick, oppressive, as if something was lingering just beyond my sight. I held my breath, listening, my heart racing, when I heard it again. The whisper. "Evie." My throat tightened and my skin prickled with dread. It felt close, so close I could almost feel it brushing against my ear. Like a breath from something that shouldn't be there. I didn't want to look, didn't want to know if the darkness had somehow crossed the boundary into my bed. But my head turned, almost of its own will, my gaze dragging itself to the corner of my room. And there, in the darkness, a shadow shifted, a vague, writhing outline that wasn't part of the furniture or the wall. It pulsed, moving as if it were alive, stretching toward me in a slow, deliberate crawl. I clutched my sheets, paralyzed, my mind screaming at me to run, to turn on the light, to do something. But I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, my gaze locked on the shifting blackness that crept closer, inch by inch, feeding off my fear. My breath came shallow, and I realized too late that I'd given it exactly what it wanted. It had followed me, taken root in the corners of my life, stretching, waiting, watching, and now it was here, hovering just beyond the edges of my bed, a smothering darkness I couldn't escape. "Evie," the whisper curled around me, cold and inescapable, sinking into my skin. I shut my eyes, my entire body trembling, and I realized with horrifying certainty that this was only the beginning. I don't know what made me go back to the cemetery that night. Maybe it was desperation, or the slim hope that facing the shade, would somehow give me control over the terror it had brought into my life. The whispering hadn't stopped, only growing louder and more constant, echoing through the rooms of my apartment until I thought I'd lose my mind. No place felt safe anymore. The darkness followed me everywhere. So here I was, standing alone in the cemetery at midnight, the silence so thick it was almost suffocating. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, shifting and swaying as if something in them was alive, waiting. I could feel the shade out there, a pulse of darkness in the air watching me. The same dread from the night before gripped me, but I forced my feet forward, deeper into the graveyard, the tall stones looming around me like sentinels. "Okay," I muttered under my breath, my voice barely a whisper, shaking. "I'm here. What do you want?" The words fell flat, swallowed by the silence. I felt ridiculous, standing there talking to empty air, but the prickling fear on the back of my neck told me I wasn't alone. I took a few more steps, glancing around, but all I could see were shadows piling over shadows. The cold seeped into my bones, and every instinct told me to turn back, to get out before it was too late. And then I saw it, just a flicker at first, a dark shape shifting at the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart racing as the figure grew sharper, emerging from the blackness between two gravestones. It stood there, tall and thin, its form almost human, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite place. It was as if it absorbed the light around it, a shape that was more void than shadow. I forced myself to stay, to hold its gaze, though it had no eyes, just an empty, shifting blackness where a face might have been. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything but the urge to run. I could feel the weight of it, pressing down on me, filling me with a terror so deep I could barely breathe. It didn't move, but I felt it inching closer, an invisible force creeping toward me, filling the air, thickening it until I thought I would choke on it. My vision blurred, and in the silence, I heard it again. The whisper, clearer than before. curling through the cold night air. Evie? It sounded closer this time, right against my ear, as if it were speaking from inside my mind. I stumbled backward, but my feet felt heavy, rooted to the ground. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, no matter how much I wanted to. The more I looked, the more I felt it wrapping itself around me, like a net tightening with every second that passed. Evie? The whisper was louder now, not a voice but a vibration, thrumming through my bones, scraping against my mind. The darkness around the shade began to stretch, spilling outward, inching across the ground in tendrils that pulsed with a life of their own. I tried to move, but the shadows reached me first, curling around my ankles, cold as ice, seeping through my skin. I gasped, my breath freezing in my throat as the tendrils climbed higher, coiling around my legs, dragging me down. I clawed at the air, trying to pull myself free, but it was useless. The shade's darkness was like smoke and ice, yet it held me in an unbreakable grip, pulling me closer. The cold crept up my spine, wrapping around my arms, squeezing my chest until I could barely breathe. My vision started to blur, the world fading as the shadows consumed me. And all the while, I felt its presence pressing into my mind, sifting through my thoughts, feeding on my fear. In those final moments, I understood what the groundskeeper had meant. The shade didn't just follow you. It consumed you, made you part of itself. I was sinking into it, becoming part of that endless, hungry darkness. My last, desperate thought was to scream, but the shadows smothered my voice, drowning it before it could leave my throat. The darkness closed over me, filling every inch of my mind until there was nothing left but the shade. They found her camera first, half buried in the earth near an ancient gravestone, its lens cracked, smeared with dirt. The officer picked it up carefully, brushing off the mud. He'd been out here all morning, answering the missing person report filed by her family. But after hours of searching, there was still no sign of Evie. The graveyard was empty, the air thick with silence that felt almost watchful. He shifted uneasily, glancing around as if expecting to see someone, or something, lurking behind the rows of headstones. It was silly, he told himself, just his imagination getting the better of him. But the further he went, the more the quiet felt wrong, too dense, like the weight of something unspeakable hanging in the air. Turning his attention back to the camera, he hesitated for a moment before switching it on. The screen flickered, damaged but functional, and he tapped through the gallery, scrolling past image after image of graves shrouded in darkness, shadows stretched long by the fading sun. Then he found it. The last photo. His breath caught as he stared, chills running down his spine. There she was, Evie. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror so raw it made his skin prickle. She was staring directly into the lens, her mouth slightly open as though she had been about to scream. But it wasn't just her expression that made him feel cold. It was what hovered behind her, barely more than a shifting darkness, a shadow so deep it swallowed the light around it. The figure was almost humanoid, tall and twisted, its edges blurred like smoke, leaning toward her as if it were about to pull her into itself. The officer shuddered, looking up from the screen, half expecting to see that same shadow lingering in the graveyard. The headstones around him were silent, unmoving, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He slipped the camera into his pocket, feeling an odd sense of dread settle over him. The air seemed colder now, the shadows longer. As he started to walk back to his car, he swore he heard something. A whisper, faint and thin, barely brushing the edge of his hearing. He paused, straining to listen, telling himself it was nothing, just his mind playing tricks. But as he took another step, the whisper came again, clearer this time, winding through the silence like a dark promise. Evie, the sound of her name felt wrong, twisted, as though it didn't belong here. He quickened his pace, his breath fogging in the chill air. But no matter how far he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, a presence just out of sight, waiting. And as he reached the cemetery gate, he couldn't resist one last glance over his shoulder. The graveyard stretched before him, quiet and empty, shadows pooling between the stones. But for just a moment in the corner of his eye he thought he saw a flicker, a figure darker than the night itself, watching. He turned away quickly, swallowing the surge of unease, telling himself it was only a shadow. But deep down, he knew that something was waiting, patient and hungry. and he wasn't so sure he'd left it behind.